Welcome to the Business and Society podcast. I'm your host, Senthil. Today, I'm thrilled to reconnect with Geoffrey Jones, a celebrated business historian at Harvard Business School. Geoff has spent decades studying how business leaders around the world create lasting impact, but not in the way you might expect. You have probably heard about strategic philanthropy and impact metrics, but Geoff's work points to something much deeper, what he calls spiritual philanthropy. It's a concept that emerged from his research into emerging markets, where he discovered that business leaders' approach to giving wasn't primarily about reshaping the world, but it was rooted in deeply held values, often spiritual or philosophical in nature. In this conversation, we explored how spiritual philanthropy differs from Western models, why proximity to poverty shapes how leaders give, and what this means for capitalism and responsible business. Geoff, thank you so much for joining me today. It's an honor to have you with me.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Excellent. We often hear about strategic philanthropy and impact metrics related to that, but your work points to something deeper. You coined the term called spiritual philanthropy. What prompted you to explore this idea?
Well, this came out of my a big oral history project on emerging markets. So we created this database of a lot of interviews, and I noticed, that a lot of the business leaders we interviewed were engaged in philanthropy. Secondly, I noticed that quite a lot of them were talking about their religious or philosophical beliefs. I decided to do a systematic deep dive into the interviews with coding and other things. And we indeed discerned a pattern which was unlike what most people had written about philanthropy in the West. So we went on to explore that and came up with the term spiritual philanthropy.
So before we go further, how do you define spiritual in this context, especially for a business audience that may not resonate with religion?
I think we're very careful to emphasize that it's not just about religion, although multiple people we interviewed were religious. It also can be about philosophy of life or simply a set of values which can be broadly described as holistic, seeing how everything in the world is interconnected. And so we have a much wider definition than purely religious.
You are a celebrated business historian. Before we even get into the spiritual philanthropy in East, you talked about it's different from West. So first, give us some stories about how philanthropy emerged in West. Then we will get into the specifics of your study.
Well, philanthropy developed in the West out of charity, as in many other societies. So historically, people had given food or alms to the poor or something. In the late 19th century, it starts to become formalized a lot more, and it really takes two different forms. The first form is in the United States. By the late 19th century, you've started to get enormous wealth. And some people a minority of people who were very wealthy started to give huge amounts of money to philanthropic foundations. Andrew Carnegie, the steelmaker, was the first. Then there's Rockefeller and a bunch of other guys too. And they created foundations unrelated to their business, which took on a life of their own. The second type of foundation you find in Europe, and it's often when families have established a company which has grown a lot, and they transfer the ownership of that company into a trust, a philanthropic trust. And a bunch of European companies are organized in that fashion. And the trust both controls the operation of the business and engages in philanthropy.
So compared to this, how different is the philanthropy in East or the Latin America or Africa?
We found very few examples of the US style of foundation. A US style of foundation had a distinct way of operating. We call it being interested in world making. Carnegie, for example, believed that people should have libraries, should be available. So he spent a huge amount of their funds seeding libraries everywhere. If you move forward to the present day, the Gates Foundation believes that health is the place where all this money should be spent. So they've developed their own agenda, but all of them can be described as world making in a grandiose sense. And you can say that's either good, or you could say it's pretty bad that unelected, uncontrolled people are seeking to spend huge amounts of money doing what they think is important. What we found in Asia and Latin America is people were really less interested in world making on a grandiose level and more interested in bringing practical relief to people by providing studentships, building schools, providing basic health facilities. And we argue that's probably because while Bill Gates doesn't typically encounter people in great distress, if you're sitting in Asia or Latin America, however rich you are, you'll probably see or know about people who are in great distress. So their values, their strategies are much more focused on immediate relief of problems and less on reshaping the world as they saw it.
How does spirituality comes into play within these differences?
We were extremely interested in why people give a large amount of money from their personal fortunes or whatever to support various types of philanthropy. Why is that? And there are some uncommon factors between, say, the US and emerging markets. I mean, religion was a factor for some of the big American philanthropists, like Hilton, who was a very active, practicing Roman Catholic. But I think there are other things going on there, including, in some cases, a desire to whitewash tarnished business careers by doing good after all the money's been made. But when we looked at what was going on in emerging markets, what we called spirituality was constantly present, really. I mean, maybe people were concerned to improve their reputations, probably. But we have a lot of people talking about values, typically the values that had come down through their families, actually. And one of the aspects of spiritual philanthropy was it was passed down from one generation to the other. In the case of India, for example, you can see that in the Tata family or the Goodrich family or the Bajaj family. Very strong sets of values originating from the founder, passed down. And those values were typically spiritually based, whether it's, Parsi or Bajaj, a mixture of Hinduism and and Gandhi's teachings and things. And that was pretty much a big difference between many emerging markets and say American philanthropy too, that it's going from one family generation to the other and becomes embedded in the families.
So I was reading your paper. It seems even within these emerging markets, there are differences, it seems. Say, for example, you write, Indian philanthropists are much more comfortable talking about their religion, whereas Latin American philanthropists are not. Why did we see that?
We did see that. And I don't think it's because Latin Americans were not spiritual, but they were generally highly discreet. For quite a cluster of them, for example, we know from various sources, not the interviews, that they were affiliated with the Opus Dei, which is a very specific religious society within the Catholic Church. But people typically do not want to talk about that. So philanthropy was much more private in Latin America. While our Indians, for example, were I think very open to talking about how they saw the world and their responsibilities to the world. So we've concluded the same thing was going on, but there's a huge difference in the willingness of people to articulate it in public. And generally, Latin American leaders, business leaders, have been fairly discreet about what they say, partly because of the difficult history of Latin America, which includes some very left-wing guerrilla groups prepared to kidnap business leaders, assassinate business leaders, highly contestable politics, for example, in Chile and things. So you have a group of business leaders who prize discretion and privacy more than case in some other countries.
You talked about India. So there are regulations and laws that requires businesses of certain size to spend some money for corporate or social responsibility initiatives. So I'm keen to understand, how is the spiritual philanthropy fundamentally different from such CSR initiatives or strategic philanthropy?
Some critics equate the law passed in India, I think in 2013, as basically a form of tax. So the spiritual philanthropy was people under no obligation except their own ethical values being willing to make this investment. The legal thing is government regulating that, and I think that's the fundamental difference. Is one better than the other? I wouldn't go that far. The Indian legislation has forced it to be put on corporate agendas. It's forced companies who weren't inclined to do anything to have to do some things. But it is also, I think, encouraged certain types of game playing, and people spend the amount they're obligated to spend on certain things, for example, related to their business and things. So when you have legislation, you also have game playing and people trying to find ways around the legislation. That's not something that the spiritual philanthropy people were really interested in doing. They hadn't, because they were motivated, right, by.
And how does mainstream businesses look at these kind of initiatives, such as spiritual philanthropy?
Well, I can't really speak on behalf of mainstream business. I think, for example, in most people in India, we keep coming back to India, but let me say most people in India recognize that Tatars, for example, have a very strong brand, and part of that brand is a recognition that they've been doing good works generation after generation. So I think probably most people can see how it builds and enhances value. They probably also see that it costs quite a lot of money, and it's a cost, and it's something some people don't want to bear unless they're obligated to bear it.
And I'm also reflecting on your fascinating book, Deeply Responsible Business. And I was listening to your lecture as well, the Weatherhead Center. One of the common thread among all businesses, or most of the businesses in history that were deeply responsible, has some element of spirituality in it. Is that a fair observation?
I think it is a fair observation, and I'd like to stress that I didn't go as a historian. I'm not a social scientist. I don't start off with a set of hypotheses that I seek to prove. I work the other way round. I gather empirical information and then see what comes out of that empirical information. So spirituality or religion was not something that I set out to explore, as a matter of fact, but it just keeps popping up, really. I first encountered this in an earlier book called Profits and Sustainability, which looked at the history of green entrepreneurship over the last 150 years. And I saw these people experimenting with wind energy or solar energy or organic, and everybody thought they were completely crazy. And they certainly didn't make any money out of it because everybody thought they were completely crazy. So I was very curious, like, why would you do that if you've got entrepreneurial talent? Why would you go down? And then I started encountering these people motivated by particular philosophies or particular religions. So that started me off. And then it's just something I keep noticing, whether it's in the oral history, it kept coming up, or whether it's in deeply responsible business, it kept coming up too. But I would emphasize again that when we're talking spirituality, we are not talking necessarily about formal religion. And some of the people in deeply responsible business are clearly not formally religious, but somehow they can just have an understanding that humanity and the planet and animal life are kind of joined and interconnected. And I think that's very important, because it means you can't, in crude terms, you don't really believe in externalities like polluting the planet or doing bad things are just external to a firm. So I think it's very important in both motivating people and shaping how they.
Interesting. Earlier, you talked about how leaders in emerging markets are often closer to deprivation and how that proximity shapes how they give. Could you share any stories for our listeners?
It's not straightforward. I was in a car in Mumbai with a prominent business leader, Parsi actually. And, we passed a lot of poor people. And she both looked at them and she talked about them to me and talked about what it was like living in one part of Mumbai. But then when you drive anywhere, you go through other parts of Mumbai and you see a huge amount of deprivation. And that story has always stuck with me, right? She wasn't doing that to put on a show or anything. It was completely genuine observation about how she felt. It's very clear that some people feel like that and some people don't. As you know, a very prominent Indian business family has built a huge building in Mumbai, which is surrounded by slums and terrible deprivation, and they don't appear to be bothered by that. But some people are bothered by it. And as I said, there is a difference between that and, let's say, Mark Zuckerberg, who's now spending most of his time in Hawaii. And really, you don't in Hawaii see deprivation or any really bad things. It's not in your face. So that's just a different world.
Does that also imply that the spiritual philanthropy we have seen in India, for example, is trying to morph the Western philanthropic model? Do you see that transition happening?
There's been quite a influence. Already the Tata family in the interwar years was influenced by looking at what was the big foundations in the United States. And they were both aware of it and to some extent wanted to emulate it. And that's been quite carefully documented. My take is a younger generation of Indian philanthropists, particularly people who've got very rich since the 1990s, since liberalization and reform, are again more influenced by American-style philanthropy, probably. Much less influenced, probably, in most cases, by spiritual philanthropy or the writings of Gandhi or, or religious beliefs. I think that's probably going on.
And the another variable that's constant across your study, it could be a selection bias you may have to clarify. Family businesses tend to engage in more spiritual philanthropy.
I think, first of all, there's a selection bias in the sense of the interviews we did. We were seeking to interview what we call deeply impactful business leaders. Now, not only in India, but almost everywhere, they're part of family businesses. The family business, is almost the norm across Asia and Latin America, if less so in Africa. So we do have a large population of family businesses. And using those, we discerned these patterns of values being transmitted from one generation to the next generation to the next generation. Is it true that all family businesses are philanthropic and want to do good in the world? I don't think so. I think some family businesses are just interested in accumulating family worth. Are family businesses better able to be philanthropic than businesses quoted on the stock exchange or controlled by public shareholders? I think they are, because companies that are not closely held, but which are dependent on the capital markets, there's a huge pressure on short-term returns and things, and people are not very sentimental about those. Investment analysts are not going to say, oh, these people are doing good in the world. They're just going to say their rate of return is lower than their competitors. While a family business or closely held family business is not subject to those pressures. So they have the ability to do more in this space if they choose to do so. I'm afraid one of the many depressing lessons of my deeply responsible business is that when family businesses became public, the values rapidly diminished. And so the companies in the West that have remained models of responsibility, like Patagonia, have explicitly chosen not to go public, but have sought alternative ownership arrangements.
Would you call spiritual philanthropy superior to other forms of philanthropy in terms of making impact to the world? Have you ever compared this set of philanthropists to others?
I think it's a good question. It's also a question that's very hard to answer, and it's a question that, in a way, is quite troubling for the study of philanthropy as a whole, because it's actually rather difficult to find good studies of what the impact of philanthropy is. And that's across systems. And if you look at when people report their philanthropic activities, they may say how much money they've spent, or they may say how many children have been educated in their schools, or how many people have been cured from that. But then the analysis sort of doesn't go any further than that. And I think that's quite worrying. I mean, quite a lot of the people I looked at in the spiritual philanthropy article, for example, they're people who'd inherited certain philanthropic traditions from their parents, and they thought it was good, but they had relatively little understanding of the impact actually, of what they were doing in a deeper sense. I personally think it's one of the things that the philanthropy sector needs to work on a little bit more, because at some stage people will start asking, or they probably are asking, particular questions like, why do you spend more on education than on health? Or why do you spend more on young people than on senior people? And I've come across very few people who could really articulate an answer to.
Well, Geoff, many of these foundations we talked about deeply tied linkages to a family identity. Where is the line between genuine values and reputation or legacy building?
I think they're interconnected. Really, families, I mean, typically, if we're talking in an abstract way, are proud of the family name. And the ones who engage in philanthropy see that as both an obligation and something that's adding value to their family names, I think. So I think it's fairly interconnected. And I don't think that's a bad thing either. It just means, if something prompts people to be generous to other people, I think that's more or less to be welcomed.
And some critics argue that philanthropy can reinforce power structures. Does spiritual philanthropy escape that, or it's just another form of reframing that power?
Well, insofar as the people who engage in it have a lot of money, why do they have a lot of money? It's the way societies are structured, how tax systems work. So, in a fundamental sense, you could say they represent a part of the problem of highly unequal societies. But at least in the case of the people who give money, they're trying to be somewhat of a solution as well.
Do you think spirituality can coexist with capitalism without being instrumentalized?
Well, this really depends, I think, on how you define capitalism. If you see capitalism in a kind of very crude Milton Friedman sense, that it's some economic system designed to maximize value for shareholders, spirituality doesn't have much of a role in that kind of a system. But that's a very narrow view of what capitalism is. And if you look historically and broadly, capitalism has never really functioned like that. If you go back 19th century, 18th century or before, people were giving away things to the poor or to their communities or something almost all the time. So I think capitalism is a way to generate wealth through the market, but it mustn't be seen as a purely narrow system in the way it is described in the work of Friedman or so. And you can see that not so much in the United States, but if you look at capitalism in Europe, where you have much broader types of stakeholder forms of capitalism with trade unions or workers sitting on the boards of companies in Germany, or, there's all those sort of things. Capitalism there works very well. And secondly, is much broader. And I think that kind of capitalism is perfectly reconcilable with religious teaching. And in fact, the Roman Catholic Church in countless encyclicals has talked about that quite a lot, about what a responsible form of business is. And it's treating workers with respect, it's treating the community with respect, and it's treating the environment with respect. And the Catholic Church and the papacy are not some crazy bunch of socialists at all. So they have a very clear and broad vision of capitalism.
What distinguishes leaders who genuinely embody these spiritual philanthropic values from those who simply signal them? I'm sure you might have seen some in the mix.
Again, that's a very subjective definition in some ways. What you can see often is a slippery slope that people beginning with strong values, and as business grows, as they become more wealthy, somehow the values get watered down and they become more token. In the Deeply Responsible book, I devote a chapter to the case of the Body Shop in Britain, which began as a highly ethics, environmental-based beauty brand under its charismatic leader, Anita Roddick. And over time, as the business grew, those values seemed to get really diminished quite significantly. And then they became a part of the brand without the genuineness behind it. So it's quite a temptation to lose the ethics and do signaling. And that happens to some people. I talk somewhere about one of the risks to value-driven business is growth. And another risk is, I don't know how to put it, taking yourself too seriously. And so you start to believe the story that you're telling and you lose the genuineness of it.
So we're moving to the last section. It's called How I Did It. So I ask all my guests 3 standard questions to learn from their life and experience. How do you handle differences of opinion in your work?
You mean, just to clarify, you mean people having different points of view than me?
Exactly.
So I think my framework is to learn from those views. I like to think, maybe I'm delusional, that my work and thought about life is constantly evolving, and it evolves through people, talking to people and listening to them. So I think listening is an incredibly important skill, and so is the ability to change one's mind, not to get stuck in a certain place.
Excellent. You're a business historian. What are 1 or 2 lessons from business history that business leaders of today can learn?
Lessons from business history is always a very difficult question, because this is cliche. History doesn't repeat itself, but history rhymes. But in fact, that's fairly true. But the question is what you can do with that. For example, we know that the financial sector has these waves. You know that when there's a build-up of the value of assets, there is likely to be a crash at some stage, and that asset values will be reset. So that's good to bear in mind, but unfortunately it doesn't tell you what to do the next day, really. You see, what I see in history are fairy patterns. I look at globalization, and I've studied how the first global economy in the early 20th century fell apart and was replaced by nationalism, protectionism, bad governments, Nazis. And I was writing already in the 2010s. I think the same thing is going to happen to us shortly. And it more or less did. But it doesn't tell you, when it's going to happen. So I think a business leader should see history as a useful data point. It's not going to tell them what to do the next day, but it will mainly, affect their mind. They realize that things change There are various patterns. And I think that can inform you at a deep level, even if it can't tell you what to do tomorrow.
What are one or two skills essential for business leaders today?
Well, that's another one of your interesting questions. And I would say you can answer it in two ways. One could be called survival skills. So business now is highly politicized, and what happens, even if you're a small business, is dramatically impacted by political or geopolitical events, even though they are light years away from your business. And we know that the effect of tariffs or the effect of the US and Israeli attack on Iran is devastating businesses, throughout Asia at the moment. So one survival skill is to be aware, make yourself aware of where the world is going, because the world is not going to leave you alone. It's going to come for you. But I said that's a survival skill. I mean, if I was wearing my hats of deeply responsible business, I'd say the skill should be to be more responsible in the world, to think because we live in a world where the environment's falling apart, where there's huge inequality, ethnic inequality, and I would be saying the skill is to play my part in making the world a better place. Because if we don't, all of us, try to do that, there's no wall that's going to protect us from the disasters that wait for us.
Well, one book you recommend to our listeners?
I think the book I'm reading at the moment is on China. It's by a MIT political scientist called Yashang Huang, Statism with Chinese Characteristics. So why am I interested in that? Well, I think China is something that's looming in all our lives, because you've got this entity which in 1980 was very poor, and in 2026 is like at the frontier of all these new technologies, whether AI or you name it. China's at the front of it and has taken, 80, 90 million, 100 million people out of poverty. And I think there's people just look at China as just this amorphous mass. They know something is going on and they don't want to understand it. So the Huang book is insightful. Do I necessarily agree with it? No. Do I think it's insightful? Yes. And he uses history to talk about China's presence. His basic argument is that peak decade for China was the 1980s, when the country liberalized and private enterprise flourished. Then there was a big turning point in the 1990s when the state came back more into China in the economy. And under President Xi, this has grown enormously. And Huang is arguing that the Chinese economic miracle is going to run into trouble because the conditions that made it flourish have gone away. And I think that's an important argument, and it's something that really takes us down to a lower level, which I think most of the world needs to engage a lot more with understanding how China works, what does work, what doesn't work. It's not an amorphous mass. It's understandable, and I think we'd all benefit from a greater understanding of it.
Seems like a fascinating book. Geoff, thank you so much for joining me today. Such a pleasure to reconnect with you and talk. Some of your ideas, you have written so many books, I don't have the count. So we get into each idea, that takes a very long podcast. So I thought we'll keep the scope narrow to spiritual philanthropy.
Well, thank you for your really nice questions.
Geoff has given so much to think about. from the role of spirituality in driving authentic philanthropic values to the very real tension between genuine purpose and reputation building. If you're interested in learning more, Geoff has written extensively on these topics, including his book Deeply Responsible Business, which explores the historical patterns of companies that have genuinely embodied values over generations. To our listeners, the takeaway might be this: whether you are leading a business or simply trying to make better choices in your life, understanding where your values come from and why they matter can be transformative. And as Geoff reminded us, in a world facing environmental collapse and massive inequality, we all have a role to play in making things better. Thanks for listening to Business and Society Podcast. See you next time.